over 60% of discretionary funds going to the military, people in their hearts know that that is not the best use of our taxpayer dollars.
That's the voice of Corey Greer, Director of Communications at Women's Action for New Directions, WAND for short. She and Caroline Dorminey, Policy Director at WAND, are today's guests on
Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
But first, here are your co-hosts,
Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back. These are trying times. This, our 49th episode, is taking place in a very different environment from just last week. We are all taking extraordinary measures to cope with the coronavirus pandemic, to try to slow down its spread and reduce the risks of infection. At Ploughshares Fund, we've closed our offices in both Washington, D.C. and in San Francisco. All our staff are working from home, including Michelle and I. We're recording this episode over Zoom, splicing it together with the help of Alex Spire, Zach Brown, Derek, Xander, and Will Lowry. They are the behind-the-scenes team who make this podcast sound as great as it does. We're going to continue to broadcast in this way for the duration of the crisis, which I fear could go on for many weeks. Michelle.
One of the really challenging elements for me about this moment is just how quickly information is changing. So last Monday, everyone in DC was hoping to continue their work in the office, hold major in-person events, and by Wednesday morning, everything was canceled, postponed, or turned into a virtual meeting. And it just was a really stark reminder for me that we cannot afford to cling to analysis from a previous time, even if it is just the previous day's information. During pandemics, the information that you have available changes daily, sometimes hourly, and we have to adapt to that new information as it comes in. We hope all of you are following public health experts' recommendations to wash your hands, practice good hygiene, and hopefully with all of the steps we are taking, we can collectively help slow the spread of the disease. On Early Warning today, we'll be discussing how this COVID-19 crisis is affecting diplomacy with countries like Iran, like the diplomatic proceedings in the United Nations. But there are other things going on in the world, not just this crisis. So we'll be talking about the recent missile defense hearing in Congress and U.S. strikes on an Iranian-backed militia in Iraq.
And then I speak with Caroline Dorminey and Corey Greer of WAND, Women's Action for New Directions. We're talking to them about the political and financial context of the Pentagon's latest budget, as well as how their grassroots efforts are sparking a new wave of public interest and concern on nuclear issues. You know, this interview was conducted last Monday, one of the last days we went to the office, but listening to it now, I'm struck by how completely irrelevant the enormous Pentagon budget is to our real lives, the real risks we face. Many of us have been arguing for years that we have to shrink the military budget in order to devote resources to what Americans here at home truly need. I honestly believe this healthcare crisis is going to be worse than it had to be because we refused to make that switch, because we refused to make that choice to invest in America, not in endless wars in the Middle East. I think that you, as we are, will be grateful for people like Caroline and Corey who are trying to reorient our nation's priorities. We hope you enjoy the smart, passionate, and informed approach they and the WAND team bring to this vital mission.
Just before the interview, we have a special In the Silo segment about WAND and WiLL members working on changing U.S. nuclear policy so that we never start a nuclear war. It takes a quick look at what exactly a no first use policy entails and what we can do to make it a reality. It also includes the perspectives of two of our Women's Initiative grantees, Jennifer Blemur and Abigail Stowe-Thurston. Together, the 5-minute In the Silo and our 20-minute interview give a great look at one of the most effective organizations working on these issues today. As always, if you like what you hear, give us a rating, a review, or a share. Your feedback is how we make this podcast better. And if you have a question you'd like to submit, please reach out to us on Twitter at any time. We're at PressButtonPod.
We've got a lot to share with you today, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Stowe. Joining me today is first-time guest Dr. Laura Grego, a senior scientist in the Global Security Program of the Union of Concerned Scientists. And we are also joined by Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Director of Policy at Ploughshares Fund. Ladies, welcome to our first remote early warning.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks for having me.
As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear news, since that's about the amount of time a U.S. president would have to decide whether to launch nuclear weapons when faced with the prospect of an incoming attack. Our time starts now. Laura, last week, the House Armed Services Committee's Strategic Forces Subcommittee held a hearing in which DoD officials were asked about missile defense budget priorities. You had a really excellent thread about this on Twitter, noting that the U.S. seems prepared to continue to invest billions on this technology despite no real measures of whether or not it's working. So what is the state of play with this technology? Is it actually linked to threats? And if it's not working, why are we so keen to continue developing it?
Yeah, so when you say billions, this year, to be exact, the budget is $20.3 billion.
Oh my God.
This year, right? So, and about half of that is going to the Missile Defense Agency. So it's a lot of money. The centerpiece of the U.S. strategic missile defense system is the Homeland Defense's ground-based mid-course defense system. And that system has cost more than $40 billion already and still can't really make a better than 50% success rate on its tests. So it's never worked very well, but we keep funding it. I think Congress members tend to need to have an answer when asked about what are we doing about North Korea as they advance their nuclear and missile programs. And this is a convenient answer for that. And it doesn't seem like there's a real great criteria for when do we just say it works, it's enough, or we're done with this path, we just can't invest anymore. The sunk, there's a sunk cost, reason people want to, if you put a lot of money into it, you don't want to waste it. So this year, the GMD system faced a big setback. The centerpiece technology of that system, which is the kill vehicle, which is the thing that's designed to smash into an incoming warhead, has always been a problem, and there was a program to redesign it. And it was canceled last August, but not until after having spent $1.2 billion. So they're going to start over again. But meanwhile, there's this effort to shore up the system with a bunch of everything else, sort of all hands on deck. So pulling in theater missile programs like THAAD and the Aegis missile defense system, which is a regional defense ship-based with a couple of Aegis ashore facilities. And the thing that's most important when talking about the Aegis, there's a new interceptor for that. And it's been tasked to have a test probably as early as this spring against an ICBM range target. So on one hand, you see, okay, they're trying to fill in for the faults of the existing system. But the Aegis system will be mobile. It will have scores of ships and hundreds of interceptors. And if those interceptors are demonstrated to be strategic capable interceptors, meaning interceptors that can counter ICBMs, you can imagine that you have hundreds of those, then Russia and China start to pay attention, and we'll have to have those conversations. Those can really interfere with long-term nuclear reductions. And we certainly will need to be talking about them in our arms control discussions.
Mary, last week the U.S. launched airstrikes against an Iran-backed militia located in Iraq that it blamed for a rocket attack that killed 2 American troops and a British soldier. Is this likely to escalate further?
The short answer is, in normal circumstances, yes, this would definitely escalate further. The death of U.S. soldiers and 1 British soldier was very clearly a red line. This was a tragedy. The U.S., responded with airstrikes almost immediately that, again, under normal circumstances, would likely provoke a response from the Iranian-backed militias, if not Iran itself. Iraq has already responded strongly condemning the attacks, but there hasn't been escalation beyond that yet. And I think very likely what we're seeing here is that everyone is rightly preoccupied with coronavirus.
Are there any other efforts that you see to constrain a march towards war?
Definitely. So last week, the House of Representatives passed a resolution requiring the Trump administration to cease hostilities against Iran because these hostilities have not been authorized by Congress. The Senate passed this resolution earlier in the year, so now it's headed to Trump's desk. He's very likely to veto it. He's already issued a statement saying that he will. So that's just a matter of time, and it's very unlikely that Congress has the votes to override that veto. However, just passing the resolution is a strong rebuke from Congress of the Trump administration's aggressive Iran policy, and it's a very strong sign of this bipartisan concern that the Trump administration's aggression could provoke a new war in the Middle East.
Finally, the news this week, Mary, as you mentioned, it's consumed by COVID-19. How have both of you seen it affecting your areas of work?
So in Iran already, there have been 14,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19. Around 700 have already died. So Iran is facing a very, very serious situation combating this pandemic, and it's exacerbated by U.S. sanctions that are preventing essential supplies and medicine from reaching Iran. So now is certainly not the time for the Trump administration to be ramping up on its aggression against Iran. In fact, now would be the time for the U.S. to be lifting some of those sanctions that are negatively impacting humanitarian aid and preventing that from reaching Iran. Now, whether the Trump administration chooses to reach out a hand to lift some of these sanctions and to help Iran, as certainly they should, that remains to be seen.
Laura, how about you?
Well, we're hearing that it's possible that the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference scheduled for this year might either be restricted to locals only or postponed until next year. If it's postponed until next year, it could look really different. In one situation, you might have New START might be extended. We might have a Democratic administration that's friendly to arms control, and the ban treaty might be entered into force. On the other hand, it might be that we have another Trump administration. New START might not be extended. The other thing that would be, a missed opportunity. This year is the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima, and we were expected to hear the testimony of the Hibakusha, and it would be just sad to miss that. A moment lost.
Well, thank you so much for joining. Our time is up.
For this episode, we go back in the silo, where Derek Zender walks us through the ins and outs of the nuclear policy movement known as No First Use. Here's his report.
We do not view nuclear weapons as a tool in warfare.
The United States is not going to use nuclear weapons preemptively.
There is no first use doctrine. We should be pushing.
Can you explain your position on no first use?
I don't believe that the United States of America should start a nuclear war, period.
The president currently has unfettered authority to use nuclear weapons at any time, and there's no point in the chain of command, short of a constitutional crisis, that would prevent those weapons from being launched.
That last voice was of Abigail Stowe-Thurston, a congressional fellow with the Nuclear Security Working Group, speaking at a Ploughshares Fund event at Macalester College in Minnesota about legislation for no first use. For this in the silo, we're taking a step back on no first use. What is it? And why is it so important to nuclear policy? Today, the United States reserves the right to use nuclear weapons at any point. Adopting a no first use policy means the U.S. pledges to never be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. It's a simple idea. Or is it? Here is State Representative Carol Ammons from Illinois on why she believes in no first use.
To me, it seemed like a common sense kind of, let's not nuke everybody on the planet. But that was not as easy as I thought it was going to be. And so I decided as an activist organizer that I would use some of those skills and tactics that I learned as a grassroots organizer.
Representative Ammons is among many legislators
who have been partnering with grassroots organizations like the Women Legislators Lobby and Women's Action for New Directions, also known as WiLL, to bring people together who don't typically talk about nuclear policy.
That community grassroots organization, the Progressive Talk, the scientists that came, really put the exclamation point on this issue. And from that, I took that to the General Assembly and talked to my colleagues and said, here's why we need to do this, right? This is why we need to pass this resolution. Here's where we believe we need more responsibility and more decision-making from you to put a check on the president so that they cannot make first strike without authorization, right? I have children, I have grandchildren that I don't want them to live in a sci-fi movie.
Representative Ammons is not alone. Natalie Higgins, a state representative from Massachusetts, is part of a new generation of elected officials who are pushing back against the emphasis on new weapons of mass destruction and instead offer ideas for investing in local communities.
I was in middle school when 9/11 happened.
Reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. Clearly something relatively devastating happening this morning there.
So for myself, my peers, we haven't known the United States when we weren't at war. So I'm really concerned representing a gateway city in Massachusetts. So that's a low-income community, former mill town, a lot of our residents are struggling financially. So the investment that the U.S. is making in new nuclear weapons or maintaining the nuclear arsenal we have does have an impact. Seeing particularly veterans in my community struggle to access adequate mental health care, struggle to access housing, I think that we need to start talking about how can we make better priorities. I'm really thrilled to co-sponsor a resolution on no first use. I think it's really important that we take a stand as Massachusetts and as the United States that we are not going to be the first to launch a nuclear attack. I don't think it's that controversial, that we wouldn't want to inflict that kind of damage on any other country.
Both Representative Higgins and Representative Ammons have been working closely with Jennifer Blemur, director of the Women Legislators Lobby and a Ploughshares Fund grantee. Blemur has a proven track record of working with elected officials to create transformative change.
If we don't end the saber rattling between these foreign entities, we are going to be the ones who suffer. We need to kind of support common sense solutions to foreign policy. And it can't just include, your button is bigger than my button and all of that extra nonsense. It has to be something where we can kind of collectively say, let's put all of the buttons away for a hot second and really think about what it is that we're trying to accomplish, which is everybody has a vested interest in maintaining their communities, staying alive, keeping their country safe. For me, I'm really interested in making this something that is a kitchen table issue for people. I know that for many people, foreign policy and nuclear weapons and defense can be incredibly esoteric, can be somewhat cerebral and existential, and it doesn't really relate to what their everyday issues are. And so I'm really interested in providing them with the tools that they need to talk about it in a way that reflects that is something that can impact your life every day.
Whether you're on the left, the right, or the center, sane nuclear policies like no first use shouldn't be a partisan issue. To learn more about this movement and find out how you can support Representative Ammons, Representative Higgins, WiLL, and others, visit ploughshares.org/no-first-use. Reporting from In the Silo for Press the Button, I'm Derek Zender. Thanks for listening.
This segment was produced by Derek Zender and Delphine Vigil, with interviews by Michelle Dover and research by Paige Pedrero.
I'm Joe Cirincione, and I'm here in the glass enclosed headquarters of Ploughshares Fund in Washington, D.C., with Caroline Dorminey, who's the policy director at Women's Actions for New Direction, and Corey Greer, who's the director of communications at WAND, as they're called. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Great. Caroline, I want to start with you because you're up on the Hill working the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, and I want to hear how that's going. What are the issues that you're working on, and what's the prospect for getting some progressive amendments to that Pentagon funding bill?
I mean, I think it's tricky. This year, we've already got a budget caps deal, so we've already set the top line. We know roughly how much the Department of Defense and the Pentagon and the State Department and Veterans Affairs, we know how much each of these agencies is going to get. And so now it's a conversation about, okay, well, how much within that top line do certain systems get, do certain programs get? And so there are things to be worked out on the margins, but the broad strokes are already there. So it's kind of almost a paint by numbers at this point this year.
We had Jessica Matthews on earlier this month talking about it, that the conversation is no longer what to cut, it's how much will it grow. Mm-hmm. That's the discussion you're having.
Absolutely. I mean, to be totally honest, we have that every year. Like, rather than the Budget Control Act actually controlling the budget, we've had a robust expansion of the budget year to year, because Democrats and Republicans, the only way that they can move forward and to make compromises, it seems, is to have increases in the non-defense discretionary side. That's where all of the domestic programs are that Democrats typically care about. Mm-hmm. And then you've got the defense side that Republicans kind of are very, very interested in preserving and don't really want to have a conversation about cuts. And so moving forward, the conversation always seems to be, well, if you want more dollars for defense, you've got to give parity, and we want more dollars for non-defense discretionary
So that's
funding.
why Democrats are in favor of increasing the defense budget, even as our threats go down, because it's linked to what they really care about. Is that the way?
Absolutely. It's every single NDAA has to be a compromise, especially because we don't have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president, and we don't have Republicans holding all three of those either. Those two parties must work together, and the only way that they found to do that is just increase everything across the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when they say Washington is broken, this is part of what they mean. I mean, it's working, right?
It's
but the
gridlock.
result is you get this broken policy where the defense just keeps going up and up and up no matter what's happening in the world. Are you working on any amendments, on policy amendments, independent of the budget figures?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're currently looking at and we're paying particular attention to is the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund. It's frequently called OCO. It's frequently called the Slush Fund, making sure that we're actually reining in that number, which is typically outside of the budget caps. And so every year, for the past few years, it's been about $60 to $70 billion. And it's meant to sustain the operations in the Middle East. But that money actually isn't usually going to operations in the Middle East. And so we're working on a lot of amendments to make sure that when that money is actually for normal, everyday operations, it should be in the base budget.
When Elizabeth Warren was running for president, she said we should abolish OCA. She said, for just what you said, there's all these things that are going on in there that they should be in the base budget, not in this, what she called, like you, a slush fund. Mm-hmm. Was she right? Should we abolish OCA?
I think that's just common sense budgeting. And I think you would be hard pressed to find someone who truly, truly thought that all of the OCO account was actually going to our wars in the Middle East, and that a portion of that, at least a portion of it, should not be folded back into the base budget. And I think that that's going to be a huge part of the deliberations and the negotiations next year. Because guess what?
Next year?
Yeah, because fiscal year 2022 is a critical year in terms of the NDAA. The Budget Control Act is going to expire this year. The thing that was imposing outside limits on how much we were spending on defense and non-defense discretionary, the thing that necessitated OCO originally, that built it into such a slush fund like it's used now, that's going away. So now what do we do with OCO? Is this the opportunity to fold it back into the base budget? Is this the opportunity to demolish it altogether and say we don't need it anymore? We're going to go back to a more realistic budget every single year. FY 2022 is going to be a huge year.
Wait, does that mean that the bond between domestic spending and defense spending is broken? You can raise one and cut the other?
I am not that optimistic because you still have the parties backing different areas. So you're still going to have some negotiation, and there's still going to want to be parity between those two pieces, even if the Budget Control Act isn't having that outsized influence. But it's a potential flashpoint.
Okay.
Things could change.
And we have to get ready for it. There's many more things I want to talk to you about, the what of the policy that you're working on. But Corey, I want to talk to you about the how. How do you communicate these issues to your members and to the broader public?
This issue is common sense for a lot of our activists and for the members of our Women Legislators Lobby. Over 60% of discretionary funds going to the military, people in their hearts know that that is not the best use of our taxpayer dollars. So that's not a hard sell for them. Our women legislators and our activists are on the ground in their communities. They know and they see what everybody needs. So for us, that's an easy sell.
These are very complicated issues that often intimidate people from getting involved. How do you tell people they can get involved in these core defense issues?
So the main thing that we do is we let them know that they have a voice. So the main way that we get involved or get our activists involved is to host petitions and to write their members of Congress. So we are kind of trying to demystify the whole process. I think a lot of people are apprehensive to write their members of Congress or call their members of Congress. And we try to show them that it's a pretty easy process and that the legislators are listening to them, whether it be the legislators themselves or their staff members.
Yeah, and you work on multiple levels, not just in Washington, but in state capitals. Is that right?
That's correct.
Tell me a little bit about WAND and WiLL. What are these organizations and what do they do?
Sure. So Women's Action for New Directions, we were formed in the very early 1980s as Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament. And so back then it was a fierce group of women. We still are fierce.
I met them. Our former executive director, Nyla Bolas, was a lobbyist. She would buttonhole me when I was on the staff of the Armed Services Committee. One of my dear friends is Susie Kerr. She was also one of these fierce women with WAND.
So at the heart, we're a grassroots organization. It's people on the ground speaking up for what they believe in. And in the 80s, they saw that the nuclear arms race was intractable. It was costing way too much money. And all that money is coming at the expense of domestic programs that helps the communities that they live in. And so we're a grassroots organization. But then in 1991, we became Women's Action for New Directions and expanded our mission to include redirecting Pentagon and military spending to those unmet human needs.
So these are the issues you work on.
Absolutely. And that's when WiLL was formed.
And what's that?
WiLL is the Women Legislators Lobby, and this is a national nonpartisan network of women state legislators that are working to redirect Pentagon spending to unmet human needs.
Yeah, well, one of our board members is a member of your of WiLL up in Washington State. So,
Gail Tolton?
Yes, that's exactly right. So tell me what they do.
So they do a number of different things. One is they introduce legislation on, so for example, the United Against Nuclear War campaign. This is to introduce resolutions that advocate for a no first use policy and sole authority. And so they do that. We also help to teach them and educate them on the foreign policy and the international work because that isn't always at the front of their minds. But we help them understand the federal policy and then bring back and redirect that spending to the states where it makes a difference for them as state legislators.
So this must be very challenging. You know, Corey and Caroline, one of the challenges you face is dealing with these tough issues with different audiences. Do you find that you have to tailor your message? Do the same talking points work for everybody? Tell me what you're finding out there.
Absolutely. It's been really interesting for us. One of the things that we actually recently did, we went to West Virginia with the WiLL program and spoke to a bunch of women state legislators there. And it was so eye-opening for us because we were able to talk to people on the ground that are in touch with their constituents and in touch with their communities, and to find that there was this whole community of progressive women state legislators that wanted to talk about defense and national security. We're actually animated by how much we're spending on defense in this country.
In West Virginia.
In West Virginia. I actually brought them a slide from the National Priorities Project website and showed them a West Virginia voter how much they're paying in healthcare out of their taxes versus how much they're paying to the Defense Department out of their taxes every single year versus SNAP benefits. It's thousands of dollars to defense every single year, whereas SNAP benefits is less than $100 out of a West Virginia taxpayer's pocket.
So, Corey, what's your role in this? Are you crafting the message? Do you do flyers? What does it mean to be the communication director working on this issue in West Virginia?
Sure. So a lot of the trainings that we do for our WiLL program are communications trainings. So that's a big piece of what I do. I also work to do some of the messaging, but we do rely on our policy director pretty heavily to do our messaging work and our talking points.
How do you feel about the progress you're making? You optimistic, pessimistic, discouraged, energized?
I mean, I wouldn't be in this if I was anything other than optimistic. I've got to keep the faith that things are going to get better. And it's hugely inspiring to work with other people in this field, and especially to the few chances that we get to go out in the field and really talk to voters and talk to constituents and talk to state legislators. It's always inspiring to talk to these people and see that it's not just in our bubble that we care about it.
One of the things we often talk about in this field is the pipeline problem, especially for women. How do you get women in more senior positions? Well, one of the answers is you have to build up the base of women involved in the field. Do you work on this?
We do. So we recently launched a new program called En Voz Alta, which means in raised voices in Spanish. So this program targets the Latina communities right now in the DMV area, in local universities.
DMV meaning?
Meaning DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Yep. So right now we're local. We're hoping to expand as the program grows. But what we are doing is we are targeting these populations because we know that diversity in the field leads to innovation, leads to creativity. And this is one of the things, this is one of the reasons why I'm optimistic, because I think that the times are changing. People are interested in hearing diverse opinions because they know that it's the smart thing to do. It's not just right. We don't just need women involved in this, to be politically correct. We do this because women have unique perspectives, they're creative, and their lived experience really adds to policymaking.
So Caroline, how do you deal with these issues? When you're going up to the Hill, are you dealing with women's issues in defense? Are you dealing with defense issues from a women's perspective? What does it mean that you're from WAND and you're lobbying on these issues?
Absolutely. I mean, I wear a lot of different hats, and so I have to be able to seamlessly transition between them. Sometimes I'm walking into the room and I'm the person that brings a gendered perspective to these policy areas. And other times I'm walking into the room with the hope that I'm going to advocate for a policy that I believe benefits all Americans. And I happen to be the only woman in that room. And so, you have to be able to be comfortable in those different positions and really focus on which piece of evidence, which kind of argument is going to win the person across the table over. That is my goal, that is my mission, and that's my responsibility.
And do you see things changing? How long have you been doing this?
Oh, well, I've been in DC for going on 6 years, but I've been working and studying in the security space, war studies space for almost a decade now. So I'm pretty used to being the only woman in the room, but things are changing, and I will say it's a lot better on the nuclear side and the arms control side than it is on defense and traditional national security issues. Women in that industry face the same uphill battles that the nuclear industry faced 15 years ago, but they're not adapting as quickly.
Well, we've been making a concerted effort in the NGO part of it anyway, and somewhat in government, towards gender equities. And, be conscious of this, be intentional about this, understand, what your panels look like, who's being quoted in your articles, who you recognize for questions. Mm-hmm. Do you think that stuff matters? Do you see it having an impact in your experience?
Absolutely. I think that without conscious attention, nothing changes. And I think that's true across the board. I think unless you are outwardly identifying a problem and taking actionable steps to improve, maybe things get better because hopefully we're moving towards a more progressive society overall. But the only way to accelerate that change, to get more meaningful diversity and to have a more representative democracy, is to intentionally uplift groups that aren't being heard from.
And Corey, how does this look from your perspective? You started off, I see from your resume, working on the Gender Equity Team for the United Nations Development Program. Then we're over at the National Democratic Institute here. What are you seeing? Trends, patterns, behaviors, better, worse, up and down?
Yeah, so to further what Caroline was saying, one of the things that we work on is battling some of these stereotypes that women face. So a lot of times you hear people saying women are inherently peaceful, or if women were ruling the world, we wouldn't have any conflict. And I actually think that that is counterproductive to women's political participation, because at the same time, people who are going against that argument might say, okay, well, because women are inherently peaceful, they may not be able to speak to defense and budget issues as eloquently as men. And we want to say that no, women are valuable because we have different perspectives, and all perspectives are useful in making good policy.
Mm-hmm. If there's a new president elected next year, there'll be an opportunity for a change of course. What are some of the things you'd want to see in a new administration on the issues that you're working with?
Mm-hmm.
You first, Caroline.
So on the policy side, what I would love to see is a complete reconsideration of the path that we're currently going down in terms of where our dollars are being spent every single year. A lot of the plans that the military has put together, they do plan on very, very, very long timelines. The budget is an every single year document, but the plans that inform what that budget's going to look like are 30 years or 50 years, because that's how long a weapon system stays in our arsenal. And a lot of those 30-year, 50-year plans are overlapping, and we're going to have to fund a lot of those weapon systems and a lot of those priorities at the exact same time. And here's my problem with that. It's completely unsustainable.
Yes.
It's perfectly sustainable in the abstract, but when we're 10 years down the line and we have to fund all of these different priorities, and who knows what our economy is going to look like, that's a huge problem. We're going to have to go from a thoughtful consideration of what our national security actually dictates, what our force structure should actually look like now, to rampant cost-cutting measures when it's already too late. I would rather make sure that we're buying the right amount of the right weapon system now than have to cut it 10 years down the line because we don't have enough money to build as many as we wanted.
Yeah.
That's a bad call, and I'm trying to make sure that we don't have to be forced into any of those decisions.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Corey, what kind of changes would you like to see a new administration make in policy, in the way they do their business, and how they structure their cabinets?
I would love to see a concerted effort to rebuild the State Department. This administration has cut the State Department's funding year over year by 20 to 30%. And I believe that in order to build a more peaceful and safe world for us all, we need diplomats in those positions in order to negotiate those policies.
And finally, let me ask you a movement question. How do you see WAND and WiLL fitting into the overall, what I call mass movements that have developed basically since the Women's March, since the January 21st, 2017 demonstrations, which were the biggest demonstrations in U.S. history, 1.5 million people on the streets? How do you see WAND and WiLL fitting into those? Are you part of alliances? Do you bring your issues into these other groups? What's your role?
We are constantly working with other coalition partners, and sometimes that depends on the issue area or the policy area or the topic or what we're trying to move the needle on. And sometimes it's a broader group of people that are all invested in the movement writ large. And so just the way that I have to wear a lot of hats and seamlessly change between them, so does WAND. We are really, really responsible and very responsive to changes in this movement. And so we have to be flexible, and we're always open to more community building in whatever way, shape, or form that takes.
Do you have any key partners outside the national security space? Do you interact with the Green New Deal people, climate change, environmentalists, women's rights groups? How does this work for you?
Absolutely. So one of the exciting new movements is actually People Over the Pentagon. And that is a coalition of friends that didn't realize they were friends before they decided to take on the Pentagon. And so we do have people that are from the national security space like WiLL and WiLL, but we also have people that are invested in this because of its environmental impacts. We also have people that are invested in cutting the Pentagon in order to make sure that we have enough money for the education of our children. And so they're coming at it from very different perspectives, but we all agree that the problem at the heart of this is how much money the Pentagon actually gets every single year.
Great. Corey, if people want to learn more about WiLL or WiLL, where do they go?
Well, at risk of sounding like a presidential candidate in a debate, they can go to www.wan.org and find more information. I encourage them to add their name to our listserv. That way they can be up to date on all the petitions and actions that we host. And if you're not that committal, you can always follow us on social media at Women's Action.
Well, I hope we can all do something about that together. We have to divert some of those resources from weapons we don't need to the kinds of programs we do.
Mm-hmm.
Caroline, Corey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, Joe.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and WiLL Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and WiLL Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.